So today we're starting with the next spread in chapter 9, which is looking at fertilization and the stages of prenatal development. So in the previous spreads, we were just looking at this idea of parenting. We were looking at this idea of what are the changes that have occurred across the years in terms of when people become parents, and what are the factors that influence or the questions that you need to ask yourself before you decide to become a parent. So now we're kind of looking at the next stage of, okay, before you actually become a parent, okay, while the child is still in the womb, what are the kind of stages of prenatal development that child goes through, okay, before they become a fully formed baby, essentially. Okay, so that's essentially what today is about. It's about fertilization and the stages of prenatal development. So the first thing we have to do is we need to, before looking at the stages of prenatal development and the kind of like key features or characteristics of each, you have to understand what is the definition of fertilization. Okay, so fertilization is basically this idea that it's related to this idea of conception. So when you talk about these words, fertilization and conception, they essentially mean exactly the same thing. So conception and fertilization are exactly the same term. So if we ask you for either of these definitions, you're giving us the same definition for both. Okay, so fertilization or conception, you know, when a mother says, or when a couple says that, okay, we've conceived a baby, okay, or, you know, we're having troubles conceiving a baby, or this idea of conception is about the successful penetration of a sperm with an egg, and they fuse together in order to make a single cell, and that single cell will form the really basic unit of what will become eventually the baby, okay? And we call that fused single unit, which composes of the egg and the sperm, as a zygote, okay? A zygote is the name that we give to that cell that has been fused together with the genetic material of the mother and the genetic material of the father, okay? The two sex cells have fused together and created that single cell, which is called the zygote. Now, the zygote will have a total, and I'm sure you guys have learned about this in previous years in science, or if you're doing bio right now, you might have learned about it again. But you should know that the zygote will have a total of 46 chromosomes, okay? 46 chromosomes, so 23 from the father, or 23 from the sperm, and 23 from the mother, or from the ova. Okay, ova basically means egg, so the mother's egg. Now, the zygote, obviously, because it's a fused cell, which is composed of, the mother's genetic material and the father's genetic material, it is going to kind of carry the characteristics or the key features of both parents. So obviously we know the father's sperm is the one that influences what sex the baby will eventually be, whether it's going to be male or female. The physical characteristics, so if the father is tall or the mother is tall, the baby might have a chance of being tall as well, okay? Even things like, for example, the rate and timing of development. So when each parent first began puberty, okay? Things like when the mother first got her period, or when the father first got his first growth spurt. Okay, all of these things are very much influenced by the mother and the father, and that is going to influence when the baby will have their first growth spurt, or to what extent that child is going to grow in terms of their height. Okay, so all of these things are influenced by genetic material. Now, we all know that the typical human pregnancy is just over 9 months. Essentially, sometimes it can be less, sometimes it can be more. It's really dependent on the mother, okay? So obviously, if you've got some complications in your pregnancy and it's actually dangerous or harmful for you to carry the baby to full term, then sometimes they will ask you to have a premature delivery or premature birth, okay? Usually this is only the case when you've got like major complications happening in birth, or, you know, the mother is suffering from some serious birth complications. Generally, yeah, all mothers, or most mothers, will carry the baby to full term, and it is safer that way, both for the mother and for the baby, because it means that the baby is fully developed and at the most optimal kind of stage of development when it is time to deliver them. Okay, so it's also important for us to know, and we've learnt about this when we first started this unit, when we looked at, you know, what are the changes that occur in puberty to both boys and girls that kind of turn them into a more mature adult. Okay, so essentially in males, what we see, the main change that we see is sperm production. Okay, that is kind of preparing them. I can't draw straight with this thing for some reason. Sperm production is preparing them for that reproductive ability, and obviously the ova forming in the ovaries of females and kind of maturing is what changes in females. Now, obviously, we did mention earlier on that ova or eggs in the female are not something that just pop up in puberty, okay? All women are born with ova, but in puberty, what happens is that those ova actually become mature. They become kind of like ripened or matured, and they become to that point where they can then essentially, you know, engage in the reproductive process, okay? And this is the reason why females are not able to get pregnant only until and after they have actually experienced or had their first period, which is called a menarche, okay? So essentially before that, females cannot get pregnant because the ova are not mature enough to actually enable or promote that reproductive process. Okay, so that's essentially just a quick recap. Most of this stuff is really common sense and we already know what it is, but just a quick recap for those of you who might have forgotten. So the next thing is the rest of this PowerPoint is just looking at the 3 stages of prenatal development. Okay, so we've got 3 stages of prenatal development. Prenatal means before you're born. Okay, so natal means, natal refers to like birth. Pre is like before. So prenatal is before birth. What is the kind of development this baby is going through in the mother's womb or in the mother's tummy before it comes out into the real world? So the first one is germinal, the germinal stage of development. Then you've got your embryonic stage of development. Then you've got your fetal stage of development. Now you can see obviously in the fetal stage of development, that's the biggest stage in terms of its duration. And that's the biggest stage in which we see the most, changes, okay? The most distinct changes occurring in the baby. That's when the baby actually starts to resemble what looks like a baby rather than looking like a little, you know, fusion of cells, or rather than looking like a little jelly bean. It actually starts to look like the baby it's going to be once it comes out into the world. Okay, so these are the 3 stages: germinal, embryonic, and fetal. And so obviously fetal coming from the word fetus, which is what we call the baby when it has come to that stage of development. Embryonic coming from the word embryo, which is what we call the baby when it's still in those very early stages. Okay, so we're going to look at these in a little bit more depth now and try to understand the key features of each of these stages of prenatal development. So the first one is the germinal stage, and the germinal stage is between 0 to 2 weeks. This is when the baby has first been conceived, and this is the first stage of prenatal development. Now, it's between the stages of conception, which is when the baby has first been conceived, until implantation. So implantation is about 2 weeks after conception. Okay, so when it's about 2 weeks after the sperm and the ova first successfully kind of fuse and meet together. Now, in the germinal stage, the first cell division occurs, and the fertilized egg, like we said before, is called the zygote. The group of cells that kind of like represent this is the morula. Okay, the morula is the group of cells that represents that fused cell there. The blastocyte is the name given to the group of human cells that follows the differentiation 6 days after conception. So differentiation is this idea that you've got certain cells that the baby will have, and those cells actually moving to their specific places in the body to form certain functions or to form certain systems. That's what we call as differentiation. Now, the inner part of the blastocyst cell will become the embryo. Okay, so that's essentially still in its early stage. It hasn't yet become the embryo. It will become the embryo in the next embryonic stage. The outer cell mass is going to become the placenta. So we know what the placenta is. It basically contains all those nutrients there that will essentially nourish the baby and allow the baby to develop in an optimal way. Now, when the blastocyst reaches the uterus, what essentially happens is that it implants itself in the endometrium. So the endometrium is an important reproductive part of the female. And at this point, this is the point at which that blastocyst actually turns into the embryo. Okay. Now, as soon as implantation occurs, the placenta begins to form. And it's important for the placenta to form at that point because the baby needs to have nutrition and proper nourishment and proper, excretion of all waste, making sure that it's an optimal environment from the get-go, from day one, to ensure that it's got a good chance of survival and a good chance of developing healthily and normally. Okay, so that's the germinal stage. Just a few keywords that you need to know. This is just a diagram taken from your book, because all these key ideas that we talked about in the previous slide, like blastocyst, outer mass, inner mass, all this stuff is kind of nicely visually represented in this slide. So I just wanted to put this one in as well. And this also summarizes to you, again, what was just previously mentioned on the slide before. So in the germinal stage, you can see that everything we talked about in the previous slide is just summarized here for you again. Okay, so that's essentially what the germinal stage is. It's the very early stages. It's only 2 weeks in duration. So the germinal stage is not a long period of development. It's just 2 weeks total, and it forms the basic foundation for this baby to develop further. Okay, and is obviously, because it's the foundational basic kind of stage, it has to occur in order for later development to occur, because obviously our prenatal development occurs in a sequence. Okay, and if only with the successful passing of the germinal stage can we then move on to the next stage, which is our embryonic stage. So that's essentially what the germinal stage is about. The next stage is a little bit longer. It's the embryonic stage. Okay, it lasts about 5 weeks. The embryonic stage is the second stage in your prenatal development, and it's measured from implantation, which we said is 2 weeks after the baby has been conceived, or after the zygote has been conceived, until about the end of the 8th week after you've conceived. So as we said before, cell differentiation continues to be something that we see in the embryonic stage, because those cells that the baby now has, they have to go to the specific parts of the body to start becoming specialized. So if I've just got a bunch of cells, I can't just have them lying about random parts of the body. They need to move to the specific area for which they are going to be responsible. So if I've got a bunch of cells moving towards the heart, they are going to be responsible for the heart cells. Okay, if I've got cells that are moving towards my, my skin related areas, then that's going to essentially become my skin cells. Okay, so differentiation is the specific migration or the specific movement of general cells to an area in which they're going to be specialized. Now, we have to remember, it's not just the cells that become, it's not just the cells that create themselves and specialize themselves in this stage, it's also your internal organs and systems. So in this stage, your baby's heart would have been started to develop, the baby's, all the organs, the liver, the brain, all these things would have started to form and develop. And we call this stage organogenesis, genesis meaning a new birth or a new life, and organ meaning organ. So essentially organogenesis is the birth of a new organ, or kind of the establishment of a new organ. Okay, we've talked about the placenta already. A placenta provides all those essential nutrients and the oxygen for the baby. It allows for the excretion of waste products to again ensure the optimal environment for the baby. So without the placenta, it's very hard for the baby to have an optimal environment where they are, kind of developing is waste-free. They have enough oxygen to basically breathe. They've got enough nutrients to basically develop and grow. Okay, so that's the placenta. That is also forming further and developing further in this stage. Now, we're going to learn more about teratogens later in this chapter, but teratogens are any kind of harmful substance that can interfere with the proper development of a baby. So they can interfere with this development by either affecting the development of the baby's brain, or even affecting how their spinal cord develops or any other parts of their body develop. So if the mother smokes, if the mother drinks, if the mother takes certain medication during this embryonic stage, this can actually be very harmful for the embryo. Compared to any other stage of prenatal development, the embryonic stage is very sensitive to the impact of teratogens. And so that's why a lot of the time your midwives and nurses tell mothers who are normal smokers that you've got to give up smoking at least for the duration of your pregnancy, because it can affect the baby's development. So that is essentially what the embryonic stage is about. And again, you've just got this summary of the changes that occur. Now, you don't have to stress knowing, you don't need to stress about memorizing each one of these in depth. I know it's a lot of information. Again, some of you who do biology might learn this in depth, but we have to remember that health is not biology. We don't expect you to know this in depth. What we do expect you to know is we expect you to know at least 2 changes that occur in the germinal stage, 2 changes that occur in the embryonic stage, two changes that occur in the fetal stage, okay? We're not going to ask you, we're not going to give you a question in the SAC that is so difficult, such as identify one change that occurs in week 4 of prenatal development in the embryonic stage, because that's way too specific, that's way too difficult, okay? So we'll just ask you in general, we're not going to specify any week. So you've got so many changes here. All you really need to do is choose one or two from either that table or from the slide, or from the slide that was here. Okay, so you could talk about cell differentiation, you could talk about organogenesis, you could talk about the fact that the placenta continues to be, developed and continues to do its work. So you could talk about any of those changes that occur there. Okay, just any two. That would be all you really need to know. Okay, and the final stage that we're looking at is the fetal stage. So the fetal stage, as you can see, looking at the number of weeks, there is the longest stage. It's measured from the end of week 8, so when the baby's 8 weeks in the womb, until birth. Okay, so until it's actually born, that's the fetal stage. Now, the fetal stage, you might have heard of the word fetus, and the fetal stage is essentially lasts up to the part of that baby when it becomes a fetus. So the stage is a period, the fetal stage is a period of extensive growth, as you can see by the number of weeks that it lasts. And this is when the baby will generally start to resemble what a baby looks like. It will start to resemble an actual functioning individual, okay? So essentially all its organ systems will continue to mature. Its brain will continue to grow larger, which is why the baby's head continues to grow as it develops in the mum, okay? All the organ systems, the liver, the brain, the eyes, all of those things will continue to develop and mature. So the baby will be able to see better the week before they're born compared to when they were in any of the other stages. Now, by 14 weeks, the placenta is fully developed and functioning. And like we said before, the placenta is simply a very important organ that provides oxygen, that provides nutrients, and that allows for the excretion of waste. Now, because the placenta allows for the exchange of substances, like if the mum drinks milk or eats cheese, that calcium from there will essentially will essentially go to the baby as well. That's a good thing. But sometimes the fact that the placenta allows for the exchange of substances can be a bad thing, especially if you're a mother, you're like going to be a potential mother, you've got a baby in you, and you're still smoking, or you're still drinking alcohol, or you're taking illicit drugs, okay, or you're consuming foods that could potentially be harmful for a baby, just normal food. So you guys might not know this, we're going to learn about this, but even things like having like Macca's soft serve is actually dangerous when you're pregnant because of certain bacteria, okay? Something you might know is that eating sushi can also be dangerous, okay? Eating raw fish, all of those things can be really dangerous when you're pregnant. So it's really important to make sure that the mother understands that, because even though the fetus is starting to develop, we can't guarantee that this fetus is now suddenly invincible, that it will not be at risk of harm, that, you know what, I've already passed the embryonic stage, the baby's fine, it's going to deliver to full term, because people can still have miscarriages or birth complications, closer to pregnancy as well. Okay, closer to childbirth, sorry. So remember, the placenta acts like a lung, it removes your waste, and it basically supplies the fetus with all the important nutrients. And by avoiding teratogens like alcohol use, like tobacco use, we're able to protect that baby from being exposed to any of those more dangerous substances there, and essentially promote the most optimal development for the baby. So that's the fetal stage. The fetal stage, some of the changes that we see, and I'm just going to show you this little photo here. This is not from your book, it's just from the internet, but it's good to always get a visual representation of what it looks like. So you can see here in picture A, on the bottom of the page here, you can see that the baby, it doesn't even look like a baby, it just looks like a little tadpole or a little jelly bean, okay? It's just 5 weeks, this is just 5 weeks after conception. You can see that it's very small in size, it's barely grown at all, okay? Some of the essential organs have started to develop, okay? So we can see the eyes, we can't really see the heart, but, some of the organs have developed there. There is some semblance of a brain developing as well, okay? But it's not a lot. At 14 weeks, you can see that now this is actually starting to look like a baby rather than a jelly bean, okay? We can see some actual fingertips there. We can see like the little feet, Okay, we can see the ear, we can see the eye actually forming a bit more. The head has become significantly bigger as well, okay, which is again accommodating for that growth of the brain inside there. B for brain. Okay, so this is the fetus at this point. Okay, this is the basic idea of what the fetus is. It's about 6 centimeters long, so it has grown in length as well. If we look at the last picture here, this is 20 weeks. So this is, again, older as well. And now the baby is actually getting a lot bigger. It's in fact so big that it looks like it can barely kind of like, fit inside anymore. So by the end of the second trimester, which is 24 weeks, the fetus will grow. So this fetus here is going to grow to about 30 centimeters in length, which is 30 centimeters, it's like the size of a ruler essentially. Okay, so it's obviously growing a lot. It's obviously, it's obviously growing a lot. And again, those organs which were starting to develop slowly are continuing to develop a lot more here. So we can see proper hands now, we can see proper feet, okay? We can see the head is also much bigger. So essentially that's what the fetal stage kind of looks like, okay? This is within the fetal stage. So now looking at this table here of the characteristics that occur. So like I said before, you don't need to know specific weeks. So I'm not going to ask you, give me an example of a change that occurs during weeks 19 to 23. No, that's way too specific. We will ask you though, provide 2 examples of general changes that occur to the fetus during the fetal stage. So then you might say the tongue develops taste buds, or you might say that, the sex of the baby can be determined, okay? Or you can say that, what else do we have? The fetus will start to move in a strong and coordinated way. So movements are available there, are something that the fetus can do, okay? So essentially any of these 2 characteristics from either this table or from the previous slide will be fine. Just looking at what are the different changes that occur in each stage. All right, what have I done? Okay, and the last slide here is just looking at what is the progression of development from fetal stage to birth. So obviously I have, this is just a diagram, like a little animated diagram that just shows you what actually occurs from the beginning of the fetal stage, which is about 9 weeks, to the full term development, which is 40 weeks. Okay, and like we said before, not all babies will actually be born at 40 weeks, which is full term. Some babies might have to, because of complications, might have to be delivered through C-section or cesarean at 36 weeks or 32 weeks, okay? But you can see that because they're not fully developed yet, for example, here at 32 weeks, the bones are still, the bones have fully developed, but maybe other parts, for example, the muscles haven't yet fully developed. So the baby's quite weak. And that's why babies who are developed prematurely, you might have seen in movies or maybe from personal experience, if you have aunts or uncles or parents who've given birth recently, prematurely, you would notice that babies who are delivered prematurely have to stay in ICU for some time. You can't just take them home straight away because they are still premature. They're still kind of developing and they're still very weak and frail compared to a full-term delivery. Okay, so that's essentially just a quick overview again. And again, this gives you all the kind of ideas as well. So progression of development from fetal stage. So you could even say the fingers and toes develop, lungs begin to develop. Okay, all these things are also examples of changes. Okay, all these captions give you examples of changes that occur in the fetal stage. And I think that was the last slide. So that's basically it for today. I'll just stop the recording here.